Should the Illinois primary be the first in the country? Governor Pritzker thinks so. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. Legislature has been in this week. With me to talk about things today, Sam Dunklau, a reporter for NPR Illinois. Welcome back, Sam.
Thanks, Bernie.
And Peter Hancock, State House reporter, Capitol News Illinois. Welcome back, Peter.
Thanks, Bernie.
Okay, so Iowa Democratic primary, days without real, solid, final results, a mess. Governor Pritzker says, let's make Illinois first in the country. We are now way behind the pack. We're after Super Tuesday. We are March 17th this year. In 2018, when President Obama was a favorite son running for president, we moved the primary up to 2008, moved up the primary up to February, I think, but it's back in March. Behind most, usually the deal is done. Peter, is this a great idea?
Well, this has been talked about for decades now. The Iowa caucuses start in February and immediately followed by the New Hampshire primaries. Two states that are overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly rural, and don't really represent the broad cross-section of America. And there has been talk for some time that maybe somebody else should get a chance, or maybe it should rotate around a little bit. But then, Governor Pritzker mentioned that, I think, at first on Monday night, on the eve of the Iowa caucuses, and then...
Well, the caucuses were Monday, and then...
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, the debacle.
Yes, and it started unfolding.
The way that unfolded really made people think that maybe Iowa... Maybe this is a little too tough of a job for Iowa.
Yeah. Well, of course, Illinois has had its own problems with elections, and obviously, I don't think that people still joke downstate about dead people voting in Chicago. I think that the system is better than that.
Yes,
now they have cleaned up a lot of this stuff with, there are more safeguards than there used to be, but there have been problems with ballots this year and voter registration problems in particular, which we'll talk about in a minute. Yep. Sam, is Illinois ready to be in the primetime spotlight nationally crawling with presidential candidates in 4 years?
Well, that would largely depend on whether or not the technological infrastructure would be able to handle it. It's what you were just alluding to. See, I think it should be mentioned that the real reason that the Iowa caucuses had the delays that they had was ironically because an app that was designed to make the process far more streamlined, to get results to a center location much faster, failed. Technology really kind of got in its own way in that particular instance. So if Illinois was to become one of the first primary states in the nation. And remember, the arguments that Governor Pritzker and others have made are that Illinois is much more of that broad, diverse cross-section of America. If that were to happen, we would need to have our technological infrastructure in place, tested, at least more than they did in Iowa, in order to avoid that kind of debacle. It would remain to be seen, but I don't think that I don't think that we're going to be stepping into the spotlight anytime soon.
Yeah, well, it would take, I guess the Democratic National Committee has to make these decisions in 4 years, and Iowa and New Hampshire have had a claim on doing something first, although the caucus system is very different from a primary system because people actually have to go and meet in a gym, and we watched, those political junkies of us watched on TV as people move from the first candidate to the second candidate if they don't get 15%, and it's a very odd process.
And I've also seen it written that a problem that some presidential candidates might have if Illinois was to be one of the first primary states is that they'd have to make all these on-the-ground deals with various party bosses in various local election areas. And that would kind of tie them up to the promises that they've made to various election authorities, to different political campaigns early on in the presidential year. That could be a little bit of a dicey situation for a lot of candidates depending on who they're dealing with.
Yeah. Illinois also, you've got a very expensive media market in Chicago, but you've got, 6 or 7 media markets because the state is so vast, really. It would be tough. I know people like Iowa caucuses in a sense because it's retail politics where small groups of people, 50 people, 20 people, 100 people can get together and discuss things with the candidate, sometimes for hours on end. It worked for John McCain on the Republican side, it worked for John Kerry on the Democratic side in past years, that they got vetted by real voters talking to them, but in bigger places, it would be interesting if that all came to Illinois, but in bigger places you also need a lot of advertising and it's expensive.
Well, and a drawback is that in the caucus system, it can take all day. or well into the night. Because you have to show up, you have to stand with your group of people supporting one candidate, you have to wait to be counted, and as you said, you have to go to the second candidate. You can be there for 3, 4, 5 hours.
And of course, Illinois is not talking about going to, I mean, we would never do that here. You have an election, which makes some more sense, and there's early voting, so there's more opportunity for people in all walks of life to get their ballots in.
But for people who have jobs, people who can't find childcare at that time of day, it's a real deterrent to taking part.
Yeah, well, we'll see what happens. I did get to ask the governor, what about, you're talking about February, what about ice and snow? He said, oh, Illinoisans are tough, Obviously, there'd be a lot of economic benefits.
In Iowa too.
That's true. There'd be a lot of economic benefits, I suppose, if all these people and their staffs were coming to Illinois. And if you own a TV station, it's like free money in an election season because people keep throwing ads on the air.
Short term, though it may be, but yeah.
So we'll see what happens. Let's just talk about, we mentioned voter registration problems, and Jesse White, the Secretary of State, is in charge of the vast majority of the part of the automatic voter registration system that the legislature passed and former Governor Rauner signed into law, where if you go to get your driver's license updated or get a new driver's license, they basically say, we'll register you to vote unless you absolutely say you don't want to. And more than 700,000 people have been registered to vote or had their registrations updated with like a new address just in a year and a half since that took hold. But it was also recently discovered that more than 500 people who hit a keypad saying, I'm not a U.S. citizen, they were apparently all legal residents in Illinois, but they were not U.S. citizens. Or hit a keypad saying they weren't. Yeah. Their information was sent on to the State Board of Elections, then sent on to local election authorities like the Sangamon County Clerk's Office, which got one. And many of them were registered to vote. Most of them have now been not registered. It turned out some were actual citizens and hit the wrong button, or maybe we're just trying to get out of it because there was no other other way to stop that process once it began. But Jesse White said he apologized, but that part is fixed, but Republicans still have some problems with the system, and there was the House Executive Committee had a hearing on this week.
Right. The crux of the problems are, certain people that, it's as you mentioned, certain people that were not supposed to vote somehow got through anyway. And when automatic voting registration was sold to the General Assembly a number of years ago, the idea behind it was there will be all these technical safeguards in place to, first of all, bring more people who are eligible citizens to the voting rolls so that they can participate in the democratic process while filtering out those who cannot, these various subgroups. The problem is here, the technology, once again, sort of failed. And the Secretary of State has kind of owned up to that and saying that, we will endeavor to fix what you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, they fixed it that day.
Yeah, the dialogue box.
If you hit no, you hit no, I'm not a citizen, that should end it, but it didn't, because there was one line of code out of like 800,000 lines of code that weren't there.
Once again, technology getting in its own way, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So.
And it is one of those things that, just like the app that was used in Iowa, this kind of coding error, it's the kind of thing that over time it starts to erode the public's confidence in the electoral process, and that's what you can't afford.
And there have been some other problems since then. Some 4,700 16-year-old names were forwarded to election authorities when they were too young to vote. Yeah. So, and they got like letters, you're not going to be able to vote. That kind of thing is they're putting a handle on that. That didn't lead to anybody not voting, but it was another problem with this system that forwarded names that perhaps they should not have. In all, they said that of the more than 500 people who were hit the no button for citizenship but were registered, only 15, it's now, they've revised the number to 16 of them actually voted. It turns out there's only one confirmed person in that 16 who is actually a non-citizen. We know that some, including one in Christian County who voted in a couple of elections in a row, was actually a citizen who had been registered there for a long time, and the county clerk knew him well, or knew that person well. He didn't say if it was a man or a woman, I don't recall. Maybe he did say it was a man. But so even the numbers that we got are tiny, but they do erode confidence, Peter, as you say, and they certainly let people take shots at the electoral system in Illinois, especially when you have a president who talks about voter fraud all the time.
Yeah. And if you have a close election, as you do sometimes for county sheriff or for a township board that might be decided by 1 or 2 votes, that one vote could swing the difference.
There was an aldermanic election here in Springfield not too long ago, just this past year, and it was decided by 1 vote.
There are close elections, but it does not appear that any of these votes affected a close election like that. The one non-citizen that they say voted in an election and is no longer on the voting rolls was in Champaign County, and there were no close races like that there. So,
luckily.
On we go, luckily, that's right. Julie Porter is a former legislative inspector general, and Peter, I think you covered a hearing that they had. There's a panel together to try to look into Illinois ethics, given the problems that we've had with some legislators resigning and being indicted for various things.
Yeah.
And what came out of that?
The Joint Commission on Ethics and Lobbying Reform, which is a group consists of both House and Senate members, as well as people outside the legislature, met today. It was their 4th meeting, and in one of the panels, you had all 3 people who have ever served as legislative inspector general, starting.
Tom Homer was one of them.
Tom Homer,
former representative from Canton.
And Julie Porter, and the new person, Carol Pope, was there.
Former judge,
I think
former appellate
everybody was kind of interested to hear from Julie Porter, because after she left last year, she was just an acting inspector general. She wrote a very high-profile piece, op-ed piece in the Chicago Tribune, in which she laid out all the what she saw as a lot of problems with the office, and she alluded to 2 cases where she had received a complaint, she had done an investigation, she found that the complaint was founded, but she couldn't release the report. She has to release it to the Legislative Ethics Commission, which is made up of 8 legislators, and they decide whether or not it gets published. Today, she was talking about yet a 3rd case, and this was one right at the tail end of her administration. She had actually referred a complaint to the Attorney General's office. Apparently, the Attorney General's office investigated it and referred it back to, as a founded report, to the Ethics Commission, and that's the last anybody's seen of it.
Again.
And so you have this odd situation where the office is supposed to be the watchdog, overseeing the legislature, but you have to get legislative leadership's permission to do anything. You have to get their permission to issue a subpoena. And she was saying, subpoenas, and I think this was Carol Pope who was actually saying this, subpoenas ought to be confidential. But if I want to issue a subpoena, I have to disclose what I'm looking for, and then 8 other people know about it.
Right.
So the overall tenor was that this is a very weak institution that really doesn't have the ability to oversee the legislature, a legislature which has had some considerable ethics problems here of late.
Right. Are we expecting that things will get done this spring to change any of these rules?
They're not supposed to issue their report until the end of March, well after the March 17th primary. But at the end of March, they will issue a report with recommendations. We'll wait and see whether or not those recommendations actually
And of
put
course, the
teeth
legislative
in.
session, if it's on time, will end at the end of May.
Yeah, so it doesn't give you a whole lot of time.
Maybe. And to not use too stark of terms, it sort of sounds like, the wolf guarding the hen house a little bit, doesn't it? I mean,
and actually, I think Julie Porter's words were the fox guarding the hen house.
Oh, there you are. Wolf, fox guarding.
I saw something that she had written as testimony to that committee.
I mean, how can a legislative inspector general, and again, as Peter said, that wasn't the first time that she had talked about this, how can a legislative inspector general be efficient or effective at doing their job if the very people that they're supposed to be looking after are squashing their every opportunity to do so?
Well, I don't know about every, but certainly, apparently some.
By
some higher
contrast,
profile ones,
right before that panel, they had people from the executive inspector general's office, and these are the people who oversee agencies that are controlled by the governor. That inspector general also has an executive ethics commission, EEC. By law, you cannot have state employees serving on the executive committee because state employees are the ones you're supposed to be watching over. Totally different
with the legislative inspector general. Okay.
And apparently it used to also be that way. The panel that was in charge of disciplining judges used to be made up just of judges. until somebody realized that that really didn't look that well. And so they started putting lay, non-judicial people on that commission as well.
That Supreme Court Justice Ben Miller, now retired of Sangamon County, had something to do with that because they mentioned that when they hung a picture of him in the courthouse of Sangamon County. Very interesting. Just speaking of ethics, there's a former state representative, Jack Franks, who served many years in the legislature. He is now the county board chairman in McHenry County, and it turns out that, and it was through Speaker Madigan's release after the Sun-Times asked for it through a Freedom of Information request of a search warrant, it turns out Jack Franks had, there's an allegation that was being investigated or is being investigated that he had harassed a woman on Speaker Madigan's staff, and Speaker Madigan then released all kinds of information about that to the public. Jack Franks has denied any wrongdoing. This just adds to the mix of interesting and weird things going on in Springfield.
Yeah.
They were executing a search warrant on the Speaker's office on the day of the State address. So we were all looking in another direction.
Sure.
I imagine intentionally. But
Yeah. Apparently, the Sun-Times wasn't looking the other direction. They somehow found out about it and have gotten some information about that. But yeah, it's another
And I don't
case.
think it was like a raid with, sealing off anything. I think they just, the speaker had information, and somehow there seemed to be like maybe even an agreement to provide this information.
Speaker
with
Madigan
direct
says that
request.
his office, as soon as they received this information, they forwarded it to local law enforcement. They were in communications with local law enforcement saying, how do we get this information to you? According to Speaker Madigan, they didn't hear anything back for a couple days, and then they show up with the search warrant, which he says just kind of, formally spells out what it is that they're looking for.
Right, just
Get them
emails on the
documents they
case and
wanted.
such.
yeah, although not before the Speaker's office had conducted its own thorough investigation of
Right,
the
and then
complaints that were
passed
brought
on
forward.
apparently to the state police, who then apparently passed it on to one of the Secretary of State's police agencies, and then it's still just a matter of under investigation, and the Sangamon County State's Attorney is involved, and actually filed a motion after that to try to seal any of what was received because Dan Wright, the State's Attorney, was upset that the search warrant was clearly marked, this should not be disclosed to the public, and yet Madigan did. And when Speaker Madigan was asked about that, he basically said, well, that's a disagreement between lawyers or amongst lawyers. So it's very weird, but what he's trying to show that he was forthright and helpful. Some people question why everything took so long to get where it is now, and why other people weren't informed if Jack Franks was told by the speaker not to come into the State House without an escort. Very weird. I've known Jack Franks for a long time. Outspoken, interesting guy, and obviously a good talker and all of that.
And we've really heard too, Bernie, a lot of language coming from the Speaker's office saying that we made sure that Jack Franks could not come into the state capitol complex without an escort. We are providing this information and have been careful about what we've been doing in our interaction with these law enforcement agencies in an effort to protect the victim. That has been like the first and foremost statement that the Speaker's office has gotten out in front of the public in order to show that we're on top of this.
But this is the third sexual harassment case coming out of the Speaker's office. There have been multiple examples of this, and it's always been, I didn't know anything about that while it was going on, and as soon as I heard about it, I took action. I don't know how many times you can say that.
Of course, in this case, he says he did take action, but he didn't. It wasn't public action. So
this strikes me as a bit of a departure from that, only because of the detailed timeline that was provided. But anyhow.
Yeah, interesting. On to another subject, but Peter, I'm not sure if you wrote about it or your news service did, but in a rare situation so far, because this Democratic Governor Pritzker has gotten along pretty well with the Democratic legislature, but the legislature almost unanimously overrode a veto of his.
Yeah. Something no governor ever wants, but by the margin of the vote, it would tend to suggest that the governor did not put a whole lot of pressure on people.
I think he let it go.
Sustain his veto.
Right.
And it had to do with a very popular tax credit. It's popular in many communities. It's basically a sales tax exemption on parts and equipment that are manufactured for private jets.
Right.
And there are a number of facilities, many of them in the Metro East area.
There's
around
one in
St.
Springfield
Louis.
that they fix, they service private jets. So they fly into Capitol Airport here, and they this
and it's
aviation
big
company
business,
fixes them
and
up.
many other states have the same sales tax exemption because the aviation industry, these are highly skilled, high-paying jobs that they want to attract to their communities. And apparently, so this was in place from 2010 until 2015. Somehow it expired, nobody noticed.
And they weren't paying the tax after that.
And you got to wonder where the lobbyists were for the aviation industry, that they didn't have it on their radar. But 4 years pass and somebody says, oh my gosh, these companies owe like $50 million in back sales tax.
Right, which they would have to go back and charge their customers, perhaps.
So during the fall veto session, lawmakers pretty overwhelmingly passed this bill that reinstates the tax exemption, retroactive all the way back. It's in continuous effect from
to cover the 4 years when it
through
wasn't there.
the next 4 years, 2024, I think. And the governor vetoed it. He said, we don't have $50 million to go.
And these are
away.
private jets.
Yeah.
These are, which are used by rich folks, which was, he was just making the point. He said that. I know Mark Maxwell of Channel 3, WCIA, did the story, asked the governor about it at an event. And he said, we shouldn't let them off the hook. But clearly something changed because it was, I think, unanimous in the House and 54-1 in the Senate to override.
Right.
And I was, I think, was I in the Senate? I was in the House, I think, and very little discussion. It was brought up, it was explained, and they voted. So that is the mark in the legislature of an agreed situation. With clearly the governor's office not putting pressure, because I think a story I read said that 34 states have this kind of tax credit, and if you have a jet and you want it serviced and you get a tax break in one state, you just fly there. It's not like you are land bound. So we will see where that goes. So let's see, marijuana sales. First month in Illinois that recreational marijuana was legal, almost $40 million in sales.
$40 million. I mean, there were reports right from the first week that were sort of the governor's office was somewhat celebrating the fact that there was $5 million, $6 million, $10 million in sales, and now here we are at the end of the month and we're at $40 million. From what I understand, there are still supply issues throughout the state.
I think some recreational sales are cut off at least some days of the week in some of the dispensaries.
Well, they didn't get the licenses out for the growers to start growing recreational marijuana.
Right, and you can't transport this product across state lines. It has to all stay within the state, at least until the product might be legal at the federal level.
And the growing season, I think, is a few months. I don't know exactly how it is.
Yeah, it's not like you can flip a switch and all of a sudden there's a ton more.
By spring, there ought to be some more products.
Anyway, it was pretty high level of sales for Illinois. Well, if you like marijuana or don't, that's one thing, but revenue will be coming to governments because of this.
It'll be interesting to see over the next couple of months as more legal supply comes in, whether or not that sort of tract of sales can continue. I mean, if there was a big boom in the beginning because of the historical nature of marijuana becoming legal in the state, can that continue into the months of March, April, May, and so on and so forth, or will the fad sort of die out? We're not sure.
We're not. Very interesting. It's a new day. This is something that the governor wanted, the legislature did, and it's a complicated issue, and they're still trying to get more people involved in the business, particularly in struggling communities, and we'll see if it works.
And by far, of the folks that I've talked to just on the street, that's sort of the one piece of state policy that's sort of stuck in their minds this entire time. Although this last legislative session was very, very hugely consequential, legalized marijuana is the thing that everybody wants to talk about.
It did change our culture a bit.
Yeah.
Should mention there was this big national story. What was it? Oh yes, impeachment. The Senate voted with only Mitt Romney of Utah joining Democrats. He's a Republican, saying that the president should be expelled, but the president was not expelled from office. He's very happy about that. Our Governor Pritzker is not shy. He issued a very strong statement along with Democratic members of the Senate and the legislature, Congress, saying we will be a firewall against that terrible Trump. It's just kind of interesting that he, as a governor of a major state, is very strong in his language about the president.
Yeah, and in fact, Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot took particularly offense in the President Trump's State of the Union regarding sanctuary cities. She has also been yet another Illinois politician that has been very vocal in her opposition to Trump, and the whole thing seemed like it was going to be a foregone conclusion, but now that it's happened, Illinois' major players have certainly reminded folks that they stand in strong opposition to him still.
Very interesting. On a perhaps lighter note, the Illinois Manufacturers Association and its CEO Mark Denzler, they announced that they've got a contest going to be out there to kind of promote manufacturing in Illinois. They're trying to find the coolest thing made in Illinois. What do
I'm
you
going with horseshoes.
Horseshoe, you mean the food?
The sandwich with the fries on top
That's
of it.
a very, you can tell you've moved to Springfield now.
It's a very
You're-
Springfield
You're
thing.
definitely set, yeah.
For me, it's Mars Candy in Chicago. I find it interesting that our state still manufactures a pretty large crop of candy, M&Ms and such.
And I've seen, when I lived up in the suburbs, for a while, I remember going by a Mars factory. It was really fun to see that because half of my life has been spent eating Snickers. Anyway, on a sadder note, I should mention the city of Springfield and perhaps a little more regional knowledge, but Frank and Cinda Edwards and a friend of theirs named John Evans died in a plane crash about a little more than a week ago. Frank was a 25-year firefighter in Springfield and fire chief at the end. Cinda Edwards, his wife, was our county coroner for the last several years. Frank also was a candidate for mayor of Springfield just this last year and had served as mayor for a time after the death of another mayor in 2010. Very sad story. We still don't know all of the reasons for the crash, but 3 people and the Edwards dog, Lily, perished in that. There was a great outpouring of support. The funeral procession went by the fire station number 1, City Hall, and the county building in honor of Frank and Cinda, and we give our best to their families and the remembrance, and it does put some things in perspective. With that, we'll continue to watch other things going on in the state. Sam Dunklau and Peter Hancock, thanks for your help. I'm Bernie Schoenburg. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.